Happy Friday, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Go Beyond. Today, also, I always forget to introduce myself. My name is Alyssa Robinson, not just today, but every day. And I am the digital strategist here at Trietsch. And I am joined by Reverend Daniel Humbert, our senior pastor. And Go Beyond is simply a time where the two of us come together to discuss the message and go beyond Sunday morning to dig deeper into what we talked about, whether it be a certain book of the Bible, a certain topic. So this week, we've been talking about the book of Esther. And so on Monday, we dug deep into the scriptural context and the history behind Esther. On Wednesday, we challenged the message. And then today, we're learning a spiritual practice based on the message that we heard on Sunday. And so Daniel is going to talk to us a little bit about fasting today, because it is the main spiritual component that we find in the book of Esther. And so, Daniel, could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so you may recall that I guess it was Monday, we talked about the fact that the book of Esther doesn't have much, no reference to God, virtually no theological or religious references of any kind. And so literally the one sort of religious thing or practice in this case that's even talked about is fasting. And it's mentioned a few times, two of which are in one chapter, and then at the very end it's talked about. And so it's literally the only spiritual thing that's identified overtly in the book. And so I thought, well, let's talk about that since there's not much else spiritual, at least directly or overtly in the book. So if you look at chapter 4 in the book of Esther, this is the most commonly known or referred to chapter in the whole book. This is that point at which Mordecai inspires Esther and gives that challenging phrase for perhaps you've been selected for royalty is just such a time as this. So at the beginning of that chapter, when they begin to first describe that the decree has gone out that all Jews are going to be killed and laid aside, there's a reference to fasting, that when the letters from the king came into each of the communities, there would be mourning and weeping and fasting. And so there was this clear understanding that that was a part of their practice, that it was a part of who they were. And in that particular case, it was a form of and a part of mourning. When you read it, it's in verse 3. It literally says, there was great mourning among the Jews with fasting and weeping and lamenting. And most of them lay on sackcloth and ashes. And so clearly fasting in that component was about mourning. It was a way to mourn. Well, later in the chapter, when Mordecai inspires Esther and she takes up the call, we read this in verse 15. Then Esther said in reply to Mordecai, go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf, and neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. And I and my maids will also fast as you do. And then she goes on to say, and after that, I'm kicking butt. That's a different translation, but that's basically what she says.
That sounds like the Bible according to Alyssa to me.
Yeah. I'm going to go to the king, and whether I perish or not, I'm going to be ready, was her point. And it's fascinating that she uses fasting. She calls both her compatriots, the Jews and fellow Jews, to fast, and she and her maids will fast. And that was a way to gain strength and a way to gain courage and a way to be prepared for the challenge that lied ahead. And so it's really quite a fascinating concept, because I don't know about you, but most of us consider fasting, number one, not something fun. Number two, something that I don't necessarily enjoy. And then number three, we tend to sort of think, well, I don't really need to do that. Certainly Christians in modern day time think, well, that's a Lenten thing only. That's just something I'm going to do once a year. And otherwise, I don't look at this practice at all. Well, in the Hebrew tradition, as you can tell just from that one chapter, it had a myriad of purposes behind it. One was it's a form of mourning, and another was it was a form of gaining courage and strength and preparation. So there's some fascinating dynamics to all that this one practice can actually gain huge forms of spiritual strength and connection with God. That's why I love it. I think it's fascinating.
I'll be the first to admit that when I think about fasting, I've never felt a strong connection to it. I don't know if I was ever taught much about fasting. And honestly, even during Lent, it felt more like a New Year's resolution to me of like, okay, well, I'll give up chocolate for 40 days. It really doesn't, and in no way did it actually impact my relationship with God, or was I craving chocolate so deeply that like I had to trust in God, you know?
Yeah,
Like
yeah, yeah.
it felt, and it got to the point that I just didn't fast anymore because I was like, I don't see the point of this. It's not doing anything for me spiritually. And I think it's because I've never been guided through it.
Yeah, well, I would agree. And I think shame on all of us in the Methodist tradition because that's what we did to it. We kind of we gave the store away. We kind of said this isn't really that important. We know it's something we should do, and so let's give up chocolate, or let's give up coffee, or let's give up Cokes, or you know, even some of us have given up alcohol during the season of Lent, and we all felt the same way. We were like, well, this doesn't have much spiritual meaning to it, and so what is it? But throughout Scripture, there are a myriad of references to fasting, both Hebrew and Christian tradition, and it's really quite vital to our spirituality. And yet, Western Christianity in particular has abdicated it. Certainly Protestantism, but if you go to the East and certainly to the Middle East, fasting is still a huge, huge component of spirituality. I mean, Jesus would identify it as a primary component. You think, for instance, of Matthew chapter 6, where Jesus says, when you pray, when you give alms, and when you fast. And so clearly for Jesus, it's an expectation, and we've just lost sight of it.
So are we, when we're fasting, and if we're taking it in the biblical sense, is the only way to do it to literally not eat or drink? Is that because we like to have our loose interpretation of fasting and say, I'm going to fast from a specific thing, but are we missing the point if we're doing it that way?
Yeah, I would say that we are. I mean, clearly the original concept of fasting was from food. And there is still, I would maintain, a primary source of spiritual connection by abdicating food of some kind for some period of time for fasting. And yet, at the same time, in modern times, we've also discovered, man, there are all kinds of things from which we can abstain or fast so that we gain a connection with God. Because here's the deal. I think this is where we sort of disconnected in terms of fasting. The whole point of fasting is to abstain from something so that I empty myself of self and find a way to fill that void, whatever it is, with God somehow, some way. And the primary way to be filled with God as it relates to fasting is through prayer. So that if I abstain from food, then by golly, when I've got a hunger pain, let's have a conversation. God, help me out here. I just want to talk to you. I just want to find a way to gain strength. Or, as you've identified, at least I think this is what you mean, we could abstain, we could take a media fast, right? So we could abstain from all forms of media. That could be news, but it could also be the television or movies. It could be all forms of electronics, right? So my computer, my phone, the television. So I've been on a couple of personal retreats where for a period of a week, where it was required that you were on a media fast. So you were not allowed to bring your phone. You were not allowed to bring any form of electronics. And it was just to be you and God and the Bible. And so the point of that fast, that media fast, was, by golly, you got nothing else to do. So let's spend some time with God. Let's just get connected with God. And that's what happens. See? So there's all kinds of things we can fast from and still reach the point of the purpose of fasting, which is to empty self so that you can be filled with God somehow, some way.
So what was your experience with that when you did go a week without any outside influence and you were just focused on God for an entire week? What happened?
So you mean after the shakes left, or what do you mean?
Yeah.
So the first day was clearly challenging, right? Because and this, golly, I'm trying to reflect. This was almost a decade ago. So I mean, cell phones clearly were common, but they were still relatively new. We weren't completely engulfed in them. But the first day was hard. I mean, clearly 10 years ago, laptops and or computers were pretty prolific. Cell phones were, pretty prolific, but not overwhelming. And so the first day, you think about it, you wonder about it, and then you gear yourself up by saying, okay, God, either help me get rid of this desire, or just do other things that will fill the time, that will help, do that. And so by the second day, I was good. And the second day, literally what I would call opened me up to the possibilities of literally just being with God. And sometimes that was in complete silence. Sometimes that was, walking in nature. Sometimes that was praying. Sometimes that was reading scripture. Sometimes it was reading spiritual literature. It just opened all kinds of possibilities.
So, are there practical rules? So, if we're going to try fasting for the first time this week, what are some of the rules at play for how we should be approaching it and how we should be thinking about it to maximize the experience?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so again, it does not have to be food. It can be anything that you, and here's the challenging part of fasting. And I'm convinced again why we don't do it often in the Western faith tradition. We like our stuff, whatever it is. We like our food, we like our coffee, we like our drinks, we like our whatever, right? And so fasting is a spiritual practice of abstinence, and abstinence is not well liked in the Western world because we like to have our stuff. So what makes it hard is you probably need to consider something that you would actually struggle with by doing without, whatever that is. If it's your phone, or if it's the news media, or if
It's
it's
coffee.
well, whatever. So pick that. And then number two, remember, the point is not to suffer. The point is not to be miserable. The point is not that, man, I'm just going to woe is me and this is so hard. That's not the point. The point is to find strength from God, connection with God. And so in the absence of whatever that thing is, and if for you it's coffee, so you've determined, you've set it up, then as a for instance, and I make this up because I don't know when you drink coffee other than every other hour, but you whenever you would normally drink that coffee, like in my case, I drink coffee in the morning. So instead of the sit down and maybe enjoy the beauty of the morning with my cup of coffee, I sit down, I enjoy the beauty of the day and have a conversation with God. Or I read a chapter or two of scripture, or I have a conversation with God, right? In other words, you fill what you would have normally been doing with a connection with God. So you pick something, you commit to it, and then you fill whatever it is with God. And then I would just say, the time frames on fasting are myriad. I mean, in the early church, for instance, it was Wednesdays and Fridays. So we would fast on those days, and Wednesdays left fairly quickly, and then Fridays. And if ever you've had Catholic friends, you may recall that they would go without meat. Their fast was from meat on Fridays, and so they would have meat meant mammals, and so they could have fish, but they couldn't have beef or pork or chicken. And so on those days, the concept was, just from that particular component, I would spend time with God and I would try to connect with God. Or you can do it like during Lent, and it's 40 straight days of whatever you do, you're going to give it up. What I did one Lent, for instance, with my fasting, was I chose Wednesdays and Fridays to have a fast. Every other day I could do whatever I pleased. But on the Wednesday, I fasted from food. I could have water or juice all day long, but no solid food. And Friday would be the same. And so the fasting can take lots of different shapes. It doesn't have to be like these large swaths of time. It can just be a single day. You can pick a single day and go without solid food, for instance, and we'll all survive, right?
Well, and this is another thing that has bothered me about fasting is that sometimes it feels like an attention seeking endeavor and it reminds me of the you know the church leaders in the Bible that Jesus said, you're out praying in public, you're out displaying your faith for all to see as a show to other people. And sometimes fasting feels like that, of like, look at me, I'm giving up coffee, look at me, that sort of thing. Is fasting meant to be a solitary exercise, or is it a communal exercise? Like, how are we supposed to experience that, but also not make a show of it?
Sure. Well, fasting can be both in terms of personal or communal. So on a personal level, it clearly is not designed to be showy. That's not the purpose. I mean, again, in Matthew chapter 6, Jesus, when he is sharing the expectation to pray and to give and to fast, he's sharing it in the context of doing it privately. Actually, I won't go into this, but I mean, that's also set alongside of another spiritual practice called secrecy that was simply about the very thing you're talking about. We don't need to express this, tell other people about it, or talk about it. Just do it, right? And that's the component of fasting. Now, the reality is, if we're in relationship with other people and we happen to be fasting, it might come up just in terms of, golly, if I go to lunch with my friend and I'm fasting, the conversation might come up. Hey, I'm not going to eat lunch today because I'm fasting. But that's not the point. That's not the purpose. On the other hand, fasting can be very much a communal thing where a church would be fasting for a period of time for discernment or a period of time to seek God's guidance about something. And so you might call a collective fast for everybody to do that. And that can be quite powerful. And that was the original goal, for instance, of the Lenten fast, was that we would collectively together be fasting and seeking God's presence. So fasting can take a myriad of shapes. I mean, it really can. And I think there's both blessing and curse in all of that, right? Because sometimes it can get a little overwhelming in terms of all the options. And yet at the same time, because there are options, man, there's bound to be a way that fasting can connect with you. Now, let me say one other thing, and then let's try to get to the resource. Clearly there's now, well, I shouldn't say clearly, but there's now kind of a health kick for fasting going on, right? There's I forget what it's called now, but the intermittent fasting, and intermittent fasting is great, and I think it can serve a healthful purpose. What I'm talking about, however, is not a health fast. Spiritual fasting has never been designed to be for the purposes of health. To help you gain strength or to help you lose weight or to help you. Those are fine purposes and they serve great purposes, but that's not what I'm referring to. So the intermittent fast and other forms of fasting for health and or weight loss are great. But we're talking about a spiritual fast that has a spiritual purpose. And the reason for that is connection with God, is to find a way to be stronger in a relationship with God.
Well, and that feeds perfectly into the 40 reasons for fasting, which is something that you sent. I'm going to share my screen real quick so that everybody can see on our website. Let's see. We have here at tmumc.org/stories. You'll see it as the first post at the top of that page. 40 reasons to fast that Daniel shared with me earlier today. 40 reasons feels like a lot of reasons. And honestly, some of them I disagreed with. Some of them I struggled with.
Sure, I get it.
But introduce this to us a little bit of what we're looking at here.
So this is not original with me. To be perfectly blunt, I can't remember where I got it, but I've used it a number of times during seasons of fasting where I've called a church to a period of fasting. And I apologize, I can't remember where I got it. There are 40 reasons, some of which are scripturally based, some of which are just sort of theologically based. And they're all designed as a way to acknowledge this is just important stuff. This isn't something to be taken lightly. And so, like you, there's a few of these that kind of challenge my theology, but I think it's good for us to broaden our thought process about how we look at fasting. So I'm just going to highlight a couple of them. So again, I've already referenced number 3, which is, Jesus thought it was pretty foundational to who we are. And then I skipped down to, there's several others, but number 30, I have found as a very critical thing for me, which is it helps develop the fruit of the Spirit, specifically the fruit called self-control that we all struggle with. I know I do, right? If I get around some Bluebell ice cream and I'm all gone. So then 33, fasting helps us to better identify with and therefore help the suffering and the poor. 33 and 38 are highly related. Fasting gives me greater compassion for those who go without food out of necessity rather than choice, right? So if I actually know what hunger pains feel like, if I actually understand that what it would be like to go, in this case, for instance, 24 hours without food, by golly, I might have a little more compassion and empathy for people for whom that is a daily occurrence, not because they chose it, but because it's just their life. And so part of fasting can help me be more compassionate, right? And then number 35 would be a reason for either personal or corporate, but it is about discernment and wisdom and understanding, right? If I empty myself of self from the fast and fill it up with seeking God's guidance, seeking God's wisdom, then it can be really, really helpful. And then ultimately, number 40, fasting frees us from ourselves and claims us for Christ. And ultimately, for me, that's the purpose of fasting, is that it frees me from my crap, if you will, my stuff, my need for whatever, and helps me be freed up for what Jesus has to offer. I love this resource, and I can't tell you I'm 100% on board with all 40 of them, but most of them, 90% of them, I think are amazing.
Well, 40 reasons seems like plenty of reasons. I hope that y'all take the opportunity to go to tmumc.org/stories and read through these 40 spiritual reasons to fast. And let us know if you're going to try fasting this week. Let us know what you're trying out. Let us be supportive of you and help you in that. I would love to say that I'm going to fast from coffee, but I just don't know if the Spirit is leading me in that direction currently. I'm going to be selfish on that one.
Sure. Literally just start somewhere simple, like just give up lunch one day a week and try to spend, 30 minutes reading scripture and prayer, and do that in lieu of a meal, and just start that way, right? Just start some way. I can tell you that I don't fast all the time, but when I do fast, it makes a huge difference. It really, really does. It helps challenge me and it helps connect me. And I need that. So
I'll take baby steps. I'll try something. I'll leave it in the comments on Facebook what I try to fast from this week. And I hope y'all do the same.
But I actually abdicated my last fast. So my last fast was during Lent, and I gave up social media. And if you know me, you know I'm on social media a lot. And so it was very hard for me. And then ultimately, because COVID, kind of took over about, I guess it was probably around April 1st, in and around April 1st. So we were into it roughly 2 weeks. I maintained the fast until then. And then I realized, golly, I am unable to connect and communicate with others in addition to God. So I gave up the fast. To this day, I'm not 100% sure that was the right thing to do, but it felt like the right thing to do. So just interesting.
Today, as always, and remember, y'all can catch all previous episodes of Go Beyond at tmumc.org/go beyond. And I hope that y'all will join us on Sunday morning for Pentecost Sunday. We have live streamed worship services at 9:30 and 11 a.m. at tmumc.org/watch, Facebook, YouTube, Roku, Apple TV, Fire TV, anywhere you watch, we're there. So check us out. And we have a beautiful experience that I'm really excited about for Sunday morning, and you won't want to miss it. So I hope you'll join us.
Indeed. I look forward to that. Thanks, y'all.